Over the last few months, I have been reading George W. Bush's A Charge to Keep, his 2000 campaign manifesto, which is perhaps one of the shittiest books that I have ever had the displeasure of coming across. I tried to finish up this book by reading the final chapter, chapter 16, on a live stream last weekend. However, the chat proved to be a bit too distracting for me. I should have stuck with my reading more, but I didn't. And yeah, so we'll have to do more live streams, but I don't think that live streams are fitting when it is very tempting to avoid this painful ass material. Maybe we'll do something a little more interactive or more fun for a future live stream. We ended up getting sidetracked on 2020 Democratic race stuff, which frankly is much more interesting in many ways. However, I feel it is a public responsibility to point out the many areas in which George W. Bush is guilty of pushing bullshit and lying to the public. So tonight I finish my charge to keep by reading the last chapter of A Charge to Keep, chapter 16, A Compassionate Conservative. The rhetoric flies fast in this one. I'll be beginning from the start, even though I did read about 35 or 40% of it last time during the live stream. But let's do a fresh start, so that way any of you happen to miss the live stream will hear all of this horseshit in its full glory. The question was a haunting one. The young man who asked it had been silent up until then, his wide eyes watching carefully, taking it all in, as I talked with his fellow offenders at the juvenile jail in Marlin, Texas. The meeting was awkward at first. I was the only white man in the room. He didn't actually say he was the only white man. I'm sure the guards had warned these juveniles to be on their best behavior during the governor's visit, so they weren't exactly forthcoming when I sat down to talk with them about why they had ended up in jail. I was there to see firsthand the changes in our Texas juvenile justice system. We had worked hard to instill discipline and accountability. If only he cared about discipline and accountability when it came to, say, Wall Street or lobbyists or anything else, but of course, those people are of the ruling class. They do not receive accountability. These kids were tough juvenile delinquents that you and I would be afraid to encounter on the streets late at night. Super predators. Yet when I sat next to them and looked in their eyes, I realized some of them were still little boys. They had committed grown-up crimes, burglaries, robberies, violent assaults. When I asked whether any of them ever belonged to a gang, the hands slowly went up. I asked why. The kids seemed eager to respond to that question. The gang was like a family, one told me. Another, that the gang looked out for you and took care of you when no one else did. But when they landed in jail, these young men had realized the gang didn't seem to care so much anymore. One boy told me his mother and sister were the only ones who had visited him at Marlin. No one from the gang had made the trip. I guess one thing to note is that if these are teenagers who are members of gangs, there's a pretty good chance that they don't have cars and they would be unable to visit this facility. Just to be fair to the fellow gang members. I mean, that being said, gangs obviously don't care about their members too much, especially when that member gets in trouble and goes away. But in all fairness, these are not adults with the means to travel freely, so you do have to keep that in mind. I also like how he's painting this as being like a very perilous situation. Like, these kids have done all these violent things, and it was an awkward meeting. It's like, dude, you're the governor. You've got plenty of protection. You're in no danger. Stop being dramatic. The question came at the very end of the conversation, as I was preparing to leave. The young man, probably 15, raised his hand and quietly asked, "What do you think of me?" The question sprang from the deep doubt of someone who was wondering whether his life had any worth or value. He was asking, do you, the governor of my state, a successful white man, just a white man, let's say a well-born white man, that's a much more accurate phrasing, sitting here in my jail cell, believe that this young African-American from a broken family and a poor neighborhood has any chance in life? He was asking whether there was any hope for him. It broke my heart to think that any young person in America should have such doubt. I told the young man that he had made a terrible mistake and that he had to pay for the consequences by serving his time in jail. I told him that if he learned from his mistake, if he went back to school and studied hard and worked hard and stayed out of trouble, and stayed away from gangs and drugs, that yes, he could succeed. He could realize the promise of America. I assured him that people cared about him and would try to help him. I am not sure he was convinced. If the young man, of course, had known the phrase "okay, boomer," I'm sure that would be an appropriate time to apply it. This is a classic example of so-called boomer optimism, the idea being that you just tell people if they work hard and think positively, everything will work out. And that just wasn't even true by 2000. It's certainly not true now. Too many of our young people are not convinced. I guess they have seen the rise of costs as opposed to the lack of rise in wages. Maybe they've seen their parents struggle through poverty their whole life. Stuff like that can cause you to not be wildly optimistic. Or living, say, at this time 3 decades after the Civil Rights Movement and still knowing that your community is not treated equally, especially by the cops. So these kind of things could cause a little bit of negativity on the part of these youths, if only they just knew the power of positive thinking. We live in the greatest and freest and most prosperous nation in the world. Yet too many of our citizens do not believe their lives have meaning or value. Well, I would suggest, George, that might be because some of these kids don't really participate in the freedom or prosperity that our nation as a whole enjoys. The American dream is a distant offer meant for somebody else, they think. They do not believe the fundamentally American conviction that you can be what you want to be and achieve what you want to achieve, so long as you're willing to work hard and earn it. Well, the reason they don't believe that is because they know it isn't true. You can't just will yourself to be a lawyer or a doctor. Not only do you have to have the brains to do it, but you also need to have the background. You need to go to a quality school growing up, so that way you can get into a good college. And you need to be able to afford it. That one is one we should never forget about. So there are a whole lot of things that go into this. Also, if you're going to go through the college process, one thing that really helps a hell of a lot when it comes to both affording it and knowing how to navigate the college experience is having some family member or friend or mentor who knows how to advise you. If you're a first-generation college student, your chances of success are a lot lower than someone who is second or third or whatever generation. Also, I like this idea that it's a fundamentally American conviction to just be dumbly optimistic, to just think that anyone can do anything and the sky's the limit for literally everyone. I mean, sure, if your dad was the vice president and the CIA director and a congressman, then yeah, the sky's the limit for you, but that's not true for most people. This gap of hope is found in the poverty of our inner cities, where neighborhoods have become urban war zones, a world of barred windows and gang violence, and failed schools, a world of shattered glass and shattered dreams. Okay, that phrasing and the repetition of words for dramatic effect, that is clearly a Karen Hughes edition. Bush is not quite that clever, I'm afraid to say. But the gap of hope is also found in the large but sometimes empty houses of our affluent suburbs, where young people turn to drugs or alcohol or sex in a failed search for something they are missing. You mean like missing the experience of having fun with their friends and doing what their hormones instruct? I mean, look, because kids get into alcohol or sex does not mean that there's something wrong with them or their parents. Most teenagers do experiment to some extent or another, whether that's in high school or whether they wait till college when their parents aren't around. I mean, that's just a thing that happens. So, also, if we're talking about kids who end up in juvie, the kids who live in affluent suburbs are not among them because their parents have pull. And if your parents have pull, you can get caught and still get away with stuff or get by with a slap on the wrist. We see glimpses of this hopelessness in schoolyards where children inexplicably, we'll come back to that word, tragically, horrifically murder other children. And we worry about our national soul. I mean, it's explicable. There's a thing called poverty. There are things called child abuse and desperation. You also talked about gangs earlier. Gangs sometimes mandate murder. It is explicable even if the violence seems senseless, but to say it's inexplicable is almost disqualifying for someone who wants to hold public office. If you look at the world and think that it can't be explained or understood, you're confessing that you have no fucking clue how to deal with problems. Someone who understands problems should be the person entrusted with solving them, not someone who claims, well, I don't know what the hell's going on, but I'm just going to do this this set of policies and hope for the best. And I'll be optimistic and smile when I do it, and everything will work out fine. This gap of hope threatens the very fabric of America. I worry that we're being divided into two nations, separate and unequal. One nation with the tools and confidence to seek the American dream, another nation that has been left behind. So basically he's saying that he is setting up a tale of two cities where you have one nation where everyone is smiling and singing that song from the Lego movie about how everything is awesome, and the other half are doom and gloom. They don't believe in themselves, and they just float through lives like high-fiber turds. And this just isn't true. Now, he'll talk about inequality indirectly, but really what he is describing, if he had any degree of class consciousness whatsoever, he'd realize that what he's describing is inequality in a material class sense. Let's move on. We risk becoming two societies, one that reads and one that can't, one that dreams and one that doesn't. Some think they can protect themselves through willful apathy. Some put up big fences and live in gated communities. Some close the shutters, turn on the television, and withdraw. But apathy comes with a risk, because when the American dream is diminished for any one of us, it is diminished for all of us. We are one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I reject the thinking of those who would lump Americans into different groups based on characteristics such as skin color, or ethnic heritage, or economic circumstance. Oh God. Because Bush and the Republican Party under his leadership never engaged in tribalistic rhetoric. At no point did they question the patriotism of their opponents, or talk about how the gay community needed to be prevented from engaging in marriage, or talk about how religious freedom was under assault from secularists. Group thought pits people against one another, and its political expressions, quotas, and preferences demean the individual and lower standards. Despite this, he will try to, in this very chapter, claim that religiously based organizations are more moral and more caring than secular organizations when it comes to helping people with problems, and he wanted to create effectively a kind of quota or preference for those groups when they received money from the federal government, as opposed to secular groups that were not denominationally linked. So he clearly is okay with group thought so long as it favors a group that supports him politically, but he's opposed to it if it's a kind of group thought which opposes him politically. So if, say, it's a group thought that talks about racial inequality, that's not good for his brand, so can't have that. If it talks about Christians being persecuted by some unknown, clearly fantastical force, well, that's not cool. Or actually, no, wait, that is cool. We need to talk about that more. Christian persecution, that's a real problem in America today, something that keeps people awake at night. Each of us is a unique individual with a heart and a soul and a conscience, and each of us has ties to one another. Clearly, he doesn't live in a modern neighborhood. I've lived where I live right now for about a year and a half at this point. I don't know any of my neighbors. And in fact, I don't know anyone who knows their neighbors. Some of my friends lived where they lived for several years now. They don't know their neighbors. I mean, that's just not what people do anymore. We are united by a common bond of history and citizenship. President Lincoln reminded us that America is not just a collection of states or individuals. We are a single, moral community with obligations to one another. We are America. So what the hell does that mean? Well, I guess it means that we send kids to jail and, I don't know. He doesn't really explain how these obligations work out too well. We must close the gap of hope, but the answer is not found in yet another government program. The answer begins with each one of us assuming our responsibilities as parents and neighbors and citizens. I want to usher in the responsibility era, an era where every American knows with certainty that each of us is responsible for our own actions, that each of us is responsible for our family and our community, that each of us is responsible for loving a neighbor as we would like to be loved ourselves. So basically, there's no plan here. This is empty rhetoric. Everyone would like to live in a world that's more caring, but as a politician, you control the federal government. All you can do is set policies. You can aid in material ways. You affect policy through money. Moral leadership is a complete and total myth. There's no real such thing as moral leadership. You can affect the discourse, but just by talking about morality, you're not going to change very much at all. Relying on your moral leadership and saying that that's your main job is a way to get away with not doing anything. This is part of why Pete Buttigieg is so insidious, because he talks about moral leadership and he'll use that as an excuse if he is somehow elected to not do anything. During the more than half century of my life, he has to remind us that he's about 50, so we know that he's an adult despite the fact he's never actually done anything. We have seen an unprecedented decay in our American culture. Citation needed. A decay that has eroded the foundations of our collective values, citation needed, and moral standards of conduct, citation needed. What's going on here is clearly that he is setting up a 50s versus 60s dichotomy. The 50s, the conservatives tried to claim as a time of great morality, when everyone was friendly and did their duty, and the 60s was this time of wild degeneracy with hippies going around having orgies. The fact is the 50s were pretty liberal economically. Unions reached their peak, but that is something that conservatives don't want to talk about. Also, Eisenhower as president put the top marginal tax rate at 90%, and there were far more tax brackets once you got into the multiple millions of dollars. But again, conservatives don't want to talk about that. They just want to set up this false dichotomy of the Leave It to Beaver 50s and the Woodstock 60s. Of course, not everyone in either decade was anything like either of those two stereotypes, but okay, whatever. Our sense of personal responsibility has declined dramatically, just as the role and responsibility of the federal government have increased. The changing culture blurred the sharp contrast between right and wrong and created a standard of conduct. If it feels good, do it. And if you've got a problem, blame somebody else. So what he's saying is that if you want to become an alcoholic because you're under the impression you'll never be able to live up to your father, well, then you should do that. Or if you have a problem, like you can't achieve anything, you should blame someone else, your father, society, whatever, liberal bias, until you figure out that all you need is the power of your last name. So I'm glad that he was able to furnish us with some examples through his own example. So that's really nice. Individuals are not responsible for their actions. The new culture said, we are all victims of forces beyond our control. What people talk about when they talk about social forces is that we're shaped by our environments. They never said that these people are not responsible in any way for their actions. This is a straw man argument against the liberal position, which says that you have to consider things in context. That, say, considering whether a defendant is sane or not should be a thing we do. But, of course, this is a straw man by a governor who had a record number of people executed. We went from a culture of sacrifice and saving to a culture obsessed with grabbing all the gusto. We went from accepting responsibility to assigning blame. As government did more and more, individuals were required to do less and less. Once again, citation needed. The culture of sacrifice was the greatest generation. And the reason that they did it is because they had no choice. They lived during the Great Depression. And then they were called upon to fight in World War II. They had no alternative. What the hell else do you think they're going to do? And if you're talking about a culture that was obsessed with grabbing all the gusto, that would be your generation, George. And why wouldn't they? It was there. I mean, of course they're going to grab it. Again, let's get back to that point of society shapes people. The boomers came up in a time where things were great. Material opportunities awaited around every bend. You could get a good 9-to-5 job coming straight out of high school and make a good living. Well, why wouldn't you? You go to college for cheap. Why not go? I mean, look, yeah, you understand how this works. Or say if you're born with a famous last name, of course you're going to use it. You'd be dumb not to. But I think that you do need to have some self-awareness that you're using that name. Also, this whole idea that as government did more and more, individuals were required to do less and less. What are you talking about? That what? Is this accurate at all? I don't think so. This is a stereotype based on Reagan's rhetoric. The new culture said if people were poor, the government should feed them. If someone had no house, the government should provide one. If criminals are not responsible for their acts, then the answers are not in prisons, but in social programs. Every problem suddenly demanded a government solution. Well, the thing is, government policy helps create a lot of these problems, so the government should have a part in the solution. No one said that individuals should not be in part responsible. Social programs are designed to help individuals to take control of their own lives. This is a straw man against liberal positions. George W. Bush is not representing those at all fairly or accurately. And that's a disturbing thing for someone who is running for an office where he will control the federal government. He does not know how government authority should be used. He doesn't understand that government authority is an inherently material thing and that all of his moralizing bullshit is abstract in the lowest sense of the word. Fathers moved out and Uncle Sam moved in. So I think he stole that from Brett Keene's Father. Father is a song Brett Keene wrote about his dad, and he partly plagiarized it if I remember correctly. But anyway, enough about the manatee. People became less interested in pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and more interested in pulling down a monthly government check. A culture of dependency was born. No one has ever pulled himself or herself up by bootstraps since bootstraps went out of fashion a very long time ago. I'm also not even sure if it's physically possible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you're on your ass. I don't know for sure, but I think it would be something of a feat. And of course, you're not a cowboy. This analogy makes no sense, and very few people today are cowboys. Also, this idea that people lost interest in helping themselves because government checks are available. This ignores that if you're pulling in a government check, you most likely are disabled, or else you are very poor and you have kids to look after. And, they're not going to take care of themselves, so you can't exactly just leave them at home and go to work. Programs that began as a temporary hand up became a permanent handout, regarded by many as a right, an entitlement, something for nothing. So this is just pure conservative bullshit. They also were the ones in the 90s who changed the name of social programs and earned benefits in the case of things like Social Security that you pay a tax into entitlements. Social Security is, for the record, an earned benefit. You pay into it. It is not an entitlement. Entitlement makes it sound snotty. And I don't know why the Democrats caved into this. Democrats today refer to Social Security and Medicare as entitlements because they are neoliberals. I'm not sure if Bernie says that. I hope he doesn't. I think he's probably smart enough not to, but I haven't really checked up on his rhetoric in that regard. I should probably look into that sometime. The expanding role of government accelerated and sanctioned the changes in our culture. Citation needed. Also, culture's changes are not necessarily linked directly with government actions. Culture is not controlled by political leadership. And also, culture is very hard to define or measure. Talking about culture in many ways is talking about something that is so amorphous that it's hard to pin down, and it's easy to just straight up bullshit when you're talking about culture. You can talk about nothing while sounding like you're talking about something. And that's why conservatives love to talk about culture. It's a good way to just not say anything. Not too long ago, society knew without question that being unmarried and pregnant was cause for shame. People still get shamed to this day for getting pregnant out of wedlock, especially if the father is someone who is not able to help provide for the baby. Not only that, but the idea of it being a socially useful thing to shame someone after they have already made a decision, there's no reason to do that. That's just cruel. That's just mean. It doesn't actually help the person in any material way to wag your finger at them when they've made a mistake. This is just pure pandering to evangelical Christians. And it's pure pandering to this crowd that wants to do abstinence-only education and wants to judge their neighbors and blame all the problems in minority communities on the birth rate. Today, many say, no problem, government will provide a rent-free apartment and send money to help. Government condoned it with a check and society with a shrug. The government doesn't want people starving because there's a very good reason. Even though conservatives try to deny this, there is a very, very strong correspondence between someone being desperately poor and someone committing petty crimes, like theft or vandalism. If you're desperate and you have small children and you can't afford to feed them, you eventually will turn to crime if you love your children, and then you'll go to jail for it. It's easier for everyone and cheaper when you look at the cost of keeping someone incarcerated to have programs to help poor people. Anyone with a functioning brain can understand that. This is not complex. And also society condones it with a shrug. Well, most people who pay attention know that fatherless children are not exactly a new phenomenon. This has been going on forever. The idea that this is just something that emerged since the 60s and it's just some degenerate new practice that the hippies instituted is just total bullshit. But that's the implication he wants his readers, who are mostly older people who have very stilted social views. That's what he wants them to read here, even though it's not true. We can now say without question that the belief that government could solve people's problems instead of people solving people's problems was wrong and misguided. The thing is, the war on poverty was succeeding and making progress until Reagan scaled it back. It didn't end poverty, but it did reduce it. The war on poverty, despite conservative rhetoric, is mostly successful. It also mitigates the effects, just like the New Deal. The New Deal also helped to reduce poverty and alleviate the most extreme forms of human suffering. It was therefore a success. Anyone who denies it is just denying reality. That does not mean we should not help people. It means we should look for more effective means of help. We must reduce the reach and scope of the federal government, returning it to its proper limited role, and push freedom and responsibility back to local governments, to neighborhoods, and to individuals. Yeah, George W. Bush talking about freedom. Of course, this is the guy who gave us warrantless wiretapping, the Department of Homeland Defense, the security theater we see at airports now, where you have to get scanned by all these people who are barely trained to do the job and probably couldn't actually prevent a terrorist attack. He's all concerned about civil liberties. This it's just so absurd in retrospect that we've got this guy trying to pin all this as a liberty issue and a freedom issue. Here's a freedom, the freedom to not starve to death in a country where we have extraordinarily rich people who make their wealth off the backs of poor people. Some poor people should be fed and housed rather than allowing them to become vagrants. Or we have homeless veterans. It doesn't seem too radical to me to say, well, maybe we should help them out. And also, local governments do not have the resources to do shit, by the way, except in wealthy areas. And if all the residents are already well off, or mostly well off, then, they're not going to be instituting these kind of programs because they don't have to. You have to share wealth among different communities. Otherwise, you have a hyper concentration of wealth in some areas, the school district problem, and other areas just wither on the vine and die. That's why things like state and federal government exist. Government can be a part of helping usher in the responsibility era. Government sends signals every day. Oh, it sends signals, huh? So all it does is message. It's just a big show. It can pass laws that hold people accountable for their acts. Okay, that's what it does anyway. How is this different than what it does at this point? There are already laws in existence to punish people for crimes and shit. In Texas, we passed a law that says the state will suspend any license it issues if you fail to pay court-ordered child support. And to show that we mean business, we included not only driver's licenses, but also professional licenses and hunting and fishing licenses as well. You're not the only state to do that. And that is also kind of a form of state intervention, by the way, because in order to ensure the economic freedom and safety of women and children, you're taking some away from the men who are paying this payment. So you do believe in government intervention. You just believe in it in a different way. And also a way that most people wouldn't even disagree with, by the way. Like, this is not a controversial position to say that you should punish fathers who are negligent in their payment of child support. Government can pass tough laws that hold people accountable if they commit a crime with a gun or illegally carry a weapon. This is rhetoric you would never hear from a conservative today. Now, if you try to limit guns in any way, you're a radical, crazy person who just wants to violate the rights of good Americans. Also, I like how he's very specific about blue-collar physical crime. He doesn't say a word about corporate white-collar crime. And government can do a better job of enforcing those laws by expanding programs such as Project Exile, where federal, state, and local prosecutors and law enforcement officials team up to rid our communities of illegal weapons. But government is only part of the solution. So he actually has moved on from Reagan, who said government is not the problem, it's the solution. So I guess he might be moderate. He calls himself a compassionate conservative, but here he's saying that he might actually be one of those dreadful moderates. And now for the pro forma Republican statement, where a Republican candidate will pretend to care about the behavior of the elite. We all have a role and a responsibility. Corporate America has a responsibility to treat its workers with respect, keyword being respect, and to give back to the communities in which it does business. So by respect, that is a weasel word. It is very open-ended. By respect, he means calling a janitor a sanitation engineer, not giving that person a living wage or the benefits that they deserve. It doesn't mean making them full-time so they qualify for benefits. It doesn't mean giving them adequate notice if they're dismissed. It doesn't mean protecting their job with some sort of dismissal procedure that is fair. It doesn't mean fair hiring practices. It means respect. Give that employee a smile. And maybe if you're a cool manager, you could even let that person call you by your first name. Yeah, you could even have a casual Friday. I mean, you got to respect these guys. You don't have to pay them or, treat them like humans in a material sense, but as long as you got some respect. Corporate America has a responsibility to work for cleaner air and cleaner water by cleaning up old plants that pollute and by developing new technologies to manufacture and produce in a more environmentally friendly way. Well, that's intriguing. It really is intriguing because one of Bush's first and best known acts as president was to completely undo the advances that Bill Clinton made on environmental protections. He installed scrubbers on many coal plants and other polluting factories, and Bush allowed companies to remove them even though they were already in place. So he clearly doesn't care about that. He also was notoriously shitty at appointing EPA chiefs who cared about the environment. Bush was what he described as pro-business, which in his case meant anti-environment. Bush gave no fucks about making corporate America do the right thing, and he provided no incentives. He also had no interest in trying to put out regulations to encourage companies to make higher fuel efficiency vehicles. In fact, under Bush, things like the Chevy Suburban and Ford Excursion, which got around 8 miles per gallon, became very common. And then when the big gas price gouge hit around the summer of 07 or so, gas was like $4.50 a gallon, and some people were driving vehicles that got 8 miles per gallon. The reason why those vehicles were on the road in the first place is because the government did not try to mandate any kind of mileage or incentivize it in any way. So yes, Bush really held corporate America accountable when it came to environmental issues. I mean, so accountable. Mothers and dads are responsible for remembering that the most important job any of us will ever have is being a good parent to our children. We all have a collective responsibility to teach our children not only reading and writing, but also right from wrong. The thing is, lower class parents might not be able to teach their kids reading and writing. And in terms of right and wrong, yes, parents have that responsibility. But who says they don't? So who's he arguing against? Who is the person who says, yep, parents don't have any responsibility for their children? This person simply doesn't exist. It's a straw man argument once again. We must teach our children our common values, not the values of one faith or one religion over another, but the values shared by good people of all faiths from all walks of life. And here is the most telling inversion of a phrase that I think is actually a Bushism. Give an honest day's work for an honest day's wages. The inversion here implies that the onus of fairness is on the worker, not on the employer. That when you are paid by someone to do a job, you owe it to that person morally to do your absolute best. You owe it to them to serve as well as you can. He doesn't talk about a reciprocal responsibility on the part of the employer to pay an honest day's wage for an honest day's work. He puts the onus of responsibility on the worker. Respect others, respect their property, again respecting rich people, and respect their opinions. Don't lie, cheat, or steal. Extend a hand to a neighbor in need. So, stuff that pretty much everyone teaches their kids, or at least tries to, for the most part, except for that bullshit inversion about, just working your ass off and accepting whatever your masters hand down. We must celebrate and support and expand the institutions that nurture these values. The problem with government bureaucracies is not only that they are too costly, they're also too cold. So here we go with the let's divide people whether they work for the public or private sector and then talk about their personal morality in an indirect and insulting way. Often when a life is broken, it can be rebuilt only by another caring, concerned human being. Someone whose actions say, I love you, I believe in you, and I'm in your corner. This is compassion with a human face and a human voice. On my first presidential campaign trip, I visited the Olivet neighborhood mission in Iowa. I met with some of the women whose families had been helped by the program. They had received food from the food pantry and their children had selected clothes from the clothes closet. And that material help was essential to helping them get back on their feet. But clothes and food were not what they talked about. They talked about the program's director, Ann Tortoisel. One woman told me how Ann had helped her prepare for a job interview. Another how a call from Ann had kept her going at a critical moment when she was feeling lost and helpless. The Anns of America are miracle workers performing daily miracles of renewal in their community. Government should direct resources to help these programs that succeed because they touch human hearts in a human way. They are located in every community in America, and I want to lift the regulations that hamper them. Here's a secret. There are no regulations that hamper private institutions like this that are charitable. There are ways around being registered in the tax code. If you register yourself as a social organization that is not a 501c3, it's actually not that hard to do. I know at least one of these organizations here in Columbus, which is part of a national organization. I think it's called the National Federation of Labor, which is an odd name since it's not actually a labor union in any way, but it's more of a community organizing thing. They are not regulated by the government in any sense, and the way that they stay away from that is through following certain rules that prevent them from being liable for taxation or regulation. It's very easy to do, apparently. Whenever possible, I would look to community programs, charities, and religious institutions that save and change lives to help Americans in need. I support tax credits and a change in tax policy to allow even those who do not itemize to deduct their charitable contributions, because I want to encourage an outpouring of charitable giving in America. So before we get to this idea of government workers being just soulless drones, and then people who work for private institutions being the only actual humans around, I would like to point out that trying to use the tax code to influence moral behavior or behavior more generally is extraordinarily typical of post-1980 public policy. This is something that is examined in great detail in Suzanne Mettler's book, The Shadow State, I believe it's called. I think she wrote it in around 2008, maybe 2012. It was an election year, I know that. Either way, this is an extraordinarily typical thing of the neoliberal era to use tax incentives rather than actual programs to try to change the way that things operate. For our culture to change, it must change one heart, one soul, and one conscience at a time. Government can spend money, but it cannot put hope in our hearts or a sense of purpose in our lives. So, who said it could? Government is supposed to assist materially. Government does not have much of a moral role unless it is to protect our civil liberties and our material well-being. If you want to categorize that as moral, you can. I tend to think of it as more of a material thing. We should have a government that helps us seek our own self-interest. A government which frees us from problems like that so we can focus on living our lives. But he thinks we need to reform the culture. This is done by churches and synagogues and mosques. What if you're an atheist? I mean, I don't take my meaning in life from any of those kind of institutions. Also, I find it funny that he lists mosque here as if he actually cares about mosque or would give them federal funding. And charities that warm the cold of life. They're a quiet river of goodness and kindness that cuts through stone. So, like social workers who work for a local government can't be kind or helpful. Only people who work in a religious institution can be kind. This is a sort of soft implied bigotry against secular institutions. This is designed to rile up his evangelical base. This is a pure and very clear form of pandering. Some call their efforts crumbs of compassion. I say they are the greatness of America. And ironically, Bush has never done anything to help a community. So he says they're the greatness of America, so if he hasn't really done anything charitable, especially as post-president, I mean, now that he's left office, all he does are occasional appearances where he gets paid well for his efforts. He wrote a couple books, one about his dad, one about himself, and he's painted himself in a bathtub. So clearly he does not want to be part of the greatness of America. And clearly he has not contributed anything to that greatness either. I recognize their challenges are often greater than their resources, and I recognize that many religious institutions fear involvement with government because they fear it will compromise their core values and spiritual mission. Well, I'd say that those religious institutions are right. Yeah, you shouldn't compromise who you are by signing up with the government. The government will impose rules, as they should, if they're dispensing public money. Obviously, if you're a religious institution and you take public money, you should forfeit any and all right to turn someone away because they don't share your religious views, for one. And let's face it, religious communities are by definition exclusive or limited. You're either a member of a Christian denomination, or you're a Shia Muslim or an Orthodox Jew, or you're not. And at a certain point, it becomes weird if you have people who don't share a religious belief in your religious building. So yeah, it's not a natural fit for anyone to pretend that these religious organizations are a great fit for substituting for government programs. I mean, most people will not belong to a specific religious organization that they will need. And let's say you live in a town where your religion is not represented, or you happen to not have a religion. Well, you can see where the problems start to mount. That's why I support alternative licensing procedures so effective efforts aren't buried or compromised by government regulation. Earlier, he talked about how we shouldn't water down requirements, how we shouldn't water things down, how we shouldn't weaken expectations on students. But we can weaken expectations and requirements when it comes to religious institutions, I guess. That's fine. They don't need to be as effective because, they have Jesus and stuff. Participation in faith-based programs must be voluntary, and we must make sure secular alternatives are available. But government should welcome the active involvement of people who are following a religious imperative to love their neighbors through after-school programs, childcare, drug treatment, maternity group homes, and a range of other services. Disagree. Government should not be in the business of giving money to religious institutions. That is a violation of separation of church and state, and no matter how well-intentioned it might be, and with Bush it isn't, but even if someone tried to institute this in perfect faith, perfect execution and treating all religious groups equally would be impossible. And also, who the hell wants to give money to Scientology? Because under this rule, you would have to treat Scientologists equally, even though they would definitely use it as a means to propagandize. Also, how would you protect people against attempts to proselytize? I doubt that would be included. So then you'd have to have people participating in Mormon prayers or other things that they might not be interested in doing, but they feel like they have to get the support they need. Supporting these men and women, the soldiers in the armies of compassion, is the next bold step of welfare reform, because I know that changing hearts will change our entire society. Does it really make a difference from a practical standpoint where the aid comes from? Obviously this helps Bush's donors, who include a lot of religious institutions and people who are prominent in those institutions, but does it really help the people at the bottom who need the help? If you have to go to a church to get food, is that really that different than having to go to a more secular food kitchen in terms of getting food? I don't see how it changes things in a fundamental way. And also, if once churches get money from the government, then they have an incentive to keep doing it that goes beyond the passion of their hearts or whatever. Finally, to close the gap of hope, America must make a solemn commitment. Every child will be educated and no child will be left behind. I want to make my passion for high standards and high hopes to the highest office in the land. So, you don't have those high standards for religious institutions, do you, as we just observed? The president is not a national superintendent of schools and should not try to be. Well, you've had several chapters talking almost exclusively about your educational programs, so it seems like you think of yourself in that light. But the president speaks for the common good, and much of our common good is found in our common schools. We have a pretty long history at this point of presidents who do not seek the common good. In fact, I would say that all of the neoliberal presidents from Reagan to Trump have not done very much for the public good if you add them together. We are a nation where a majority of fourth graders in our cities can't read or understand a simple children's book. A nation whose ninth graders too often have a fourth grade reading level, and where the achievement gap between rich and poor, Anglo and minority, is wide. Anglo is not a catch-all for white. Anglo means of English descent. So that is a very weird way to put that. Reform of our public schools must begin with the mindset that all children can learn. That is pretty much the premise of all education to begin with. No one really refutes that. There are some students who have learning disabilities and may get segregated off from their classmates, but the idea here is that he's the first person to ever say, hey, we need to make sure that all children get taught. That's not exactly a radical or interesting stance. Some say it is unfair to hold disadvantaged children to rigorous standards. I say it is discrimination to require anything less. I refuse to condemn children to the soft bigotry of low expectations. I actually like that phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations. That was one of the most clever things that the Bush team produced in terms of a message. That being said, he didn't live up to any of these promises in any meaningful way. He passed No Child Left Behind, and the only way to really get everyone over the hump when it came to testing was to actually lower standards. So this is just great rhetoric that has no reality. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that George W. Bush himself was never a very good student, and that he never held himself to any kind of academic standards. We know what works. Schools must have a few measurable goals focused on basic skills and essential knowledge. They don't need any advanced knowledge because they just need to learn how to operate the register at Applebee's. We must measure to make sure that standards are met. Effective reform requires accountability. Someone should be praised when schools succeed, and someone must be held responsible when they fail. Accountability is empty without local control. Is it, though? I agree that local schools who have to implement stuff should have a lot of say in how they do it, but you could have accountability without local schools being the party responsible for doing the accounting. Accountability can come from a lot of different areas of government. In fact, you could have states being responsible for that, or even the federal government. Accountability is not something that has to come at the local level by definition. If we fail to align authority and responsibility at the local level, we can create a convenient excuse for failure. Just blame the central office. So basically what he's doing here is saying, hey, my plan might fail, so I'm going to pass the buck down. We're going to blame Johnson down in accounting. That's how this is going to go. I trust local people to make the right decisions for their schools because I know local parents and teachers care far more about what happens in local schools than distant bureaucrats do. And this is also another rhetorical attempt to do the Washington versus real folks thing. This is very common among Republicans and also among a lot of conservative Democrats. Pete Buttigieg in the most recent Democratic debate, the fifth debate in November 2019, played up the Midwest versus DC thing, as if he wasn't a McKinsey consultant and as if he isn't a CNN celebrity. We should pass authority and flexibility from the federal government to states. Finally, we must recognize the central role of competition in achieving better schools. Here we go, private schools. All monopolies are slow to reform when consumers have no power to express their frustration. I find it funny that Bush is really concerned about monopolies when it comes to something that should be a monopoly, and he doesn't give a fuck about monopolies in, say, tech or oil or anything like that. But it's only when it's something in the public sector. So if it's local power, he wants to privatize that and create competition. He doesn't want there to be, he wants there to be less competition in, say, healthcare industry. He's okay with companies merging and creating less competition. But when it comes to something that should be a monopoly and should be equal, where everyone should have the same amount of skin in the game to ensure that there is engagement and that there is some degree of equality, he's like, nah, pass. Don't need accountability there. Monopolies are cool. Or wait, no, then that's where he enforces monopoly busting. When we find failure, we should give parents different options, such as charter schools and greater school choice. When we created charter schools in Texas, the critics said they would be a haven for fleeing Anglo students. Again, not all white people are Anglo. Why does he keep saying that? This is so fucking weird. Who uses Anglo as just a code for white? Because that is not accurate at all. Irish people are a big contributor in America. They're not Anglo. Germans are not Anglo. There are a lot of Eastern Europeans in America, or people of Eastern European descent. They're not Anglo. Italians aren't Anglo. But no one would say they're not white. I mean, just cut this shit out. This is dumb. Yet 78% of the students enrolled in Texas charter schools are minorities. Charter schools encourage educational entrepreneurs to try innovative methods. They break up the monopoly of one-size-fits-all education. These diverse, creative schools are proof that parents from all walks of life are willing to challenge the status quo, even if it means a better education for their children. And by creative methods, he means like creating a profit margin where none should exist, paying teachers less than they should by hiring teachers who aren't certified, and also teaching bullshit like creation science in school and calling it science. So yeah, innovation, that's so great when it comes at the expense of students' education. The federal government should fund only what works in education, only those methods and ideas that prove their power to close the achievement gap. Much of what the federal government sponsors is sloppy and trendy, heralding self-esteem over basic skills. I agree that education as a field has some problems. And I agree that it does tend to be trendy and to rely heavily upon buzzwords. Actually, I don't think education should be its own discipline, but that's another subject for another day. And I have noticed that a lot of the people who go into that field are, to put it politely, not very smart. But they have PhDs that a person of their intellectual level should not have. But okay, whatever. Let's move on from that. I don't want to go off on a side rant here. Self-esteem is not taught. It is earned when we teach children to read and write and add and subtract. Federal education programs should be required to prove results, or we should move money into different programs that are spending it successfully. In one area, the research is definitive. The best way to teach children to read incorporates phonics. We should put the research to work and help children develop building block reading skills at a younger age. I want to reform Head Start to ensure it becomes an early reading and early learning program. Finally, we should not use taxpayer money to reward failure. If schools don't measure up, We should give them time to change. But if they fail to improve, there must be some final point of accountability. At the end of 3 years, if a school that receives federal Title I funds is not making progress, I would divide the money on a per-student basis, match it with additional federal education funds, and make it available directly to parents. This grant of about $1,500 a year would allow parents to choose tutoring or a different public school or a charter school or a private one. This would allow parents to choose hope over failure. I refuse to trap children in schools that do not teach and will not change. So what Bush is doing is something that conservatives like to call having the government pick and choose winners and losers. He is effectively saying that if schools don't live up to the arbitrary standards that he establishes through No Child Left Behind, that those schools will fail. They will not be given more funding to get back up the code, and then what funding they do have will be removed, which ensures further failure. And then parents who have enough money to get out will. The $1,500 will not be enough to send your kid to private school, by the way. And so the parents who have more money than that will go somewhere else. Other parents will engage tutors, but then the quality of the school overall will go down even further because of that withdrawal of money. And yeah, clearly you can see how this is another example of Bush rewarding what he calls Anglos, but by that he means rich white people who support Republican policy. So this is a way to try to let white students go to different schools and avoid being around black people. That's really what this boils down to at its core. The goal is to strengthen public schools by expecting performance. The goal is also to make sure our federal government no longer pays schools to cheat poor kids. Or poor children, excuse me. So, I think you're completely misrepresenting what you're doing. You're doing the exact opposite. You're having the federal government intervene to make sure that schools do cheat poor kids. Because again, it will be very hard to get out of a failing school with $1,500 a year. Okay, let's see. More competition and more choices for parents and students will raise the bar for everyone. The choices would all be made by the parents. Let's keep it real. Children don't choose their own schools. Anyone who thinks that they do clearly has never been a kid. And this will not necessarily raise the bar. It might raise the bar for the schools that succeed in teaching to the test, but it will lower the bar for schools that don't. Every child in America must have a first-rate education because there are no second-rate children and no second-rate dreams. No offense, George, but when you were a kid, you were definitely a second-rate kid when it comes to your intellectual abilities, your performance in school, and your dreams of owning a baseball team and running it successfully was also proved to be second-rate because you sucked at that. Your dream of becoming president was also second-rate because you were fucking terrible. So, I have to disagree. There are second-rate dreams, and you've had a few of them. This is what I mean by compassionate conservatism. The philosophy is ingrained in my heart. The words come from a discussion I had with a reporter several years ago. The reporter was trying to label me. I am a conservative, I told him. But you have done things differently, he argued. Insisting on educating every child and leaving no child behind is not a concept usually associated with conservatives, he said. Well then, call me a conservative with a heart, I replied. None of us can remember the exact date when that conversation took place, but from it grew the brand name my philosophy now wears. I didn't invent the phrase, but I adopted it and I've made it my own. I am a compassionate conservative, I said during my first presidential campaign trip to Iowa and New Hampshire in June. I welcome the label, and on this ground I will make my stand. Echoes of Martin Luther. So, for those of you who don't know why George W. Bush is a conservative, it is because he was born into a famous Republican family, and by the time he became an adult, the Republican Party had gone from more of a centrist party to a conservative party, and therefore, as a standard bearer for that party, George W. Bush had to become a conservative. Now, he was most likely a lot more conservative than his dad at any given point in his life, but if the party were still moderate, if this was still pre-Reagan, I guarantee you that George W. Bush would have been a proud moderate. At any rate, Let's hear his bullshit explanation for why he's a conservative. I am a conservative because I believe in the worth and dignity and power of each individual. You could have taken out an and there. He doesn't believe in good phrasing, apparently. My philosophy trusts individuals to make the right decisions for their families and communities. And that is far more compassionate than a philosophy that seeks solutions from distant bureaucracies. I am a conservative because I believe government should be limited and efficient. Unless, they're spying on you or trying to regulate who can get married or something of that nature, in which case the government should be very intrusive. That it should do a few things and do them well. Well, not regulate the environment. I mean, that's something that it should do, but it should do it really shittily and half-heartedly. I am a conservative because I believe in strong national defense to keep the peace. That makes sense. Maintain a massive military and then not use it, because that has always been a thing that happens. For those of you keeping score at home, if you look at the times when we've been funding our military heavily in a time of peace, i.e. the entire period post-1945, you'll see that we've rarely been loath to use the military. We've used the military as our foremost tool of diplomacy nearly every time that it's been an option. We have instigated God only knows how many coups, especially in Latin America. Not to mention some coups in the Middle East, interventions in the Middle East, interventions in Latin America. This has not been a strong national defense. It's been more of a strong national offense. And he's going to complain later in this chapter that basically Clinton cut the military, and that is just unacceptable because it leaves us exposed to the threat of something. It's a threat of something. There's definitely a threat somewhere. We'll just have to find it. I am a conservative because I support free markets and free trade. So, in other words, he is anti-worker, because those policies are really detrimental to workers. I am a conservative because I believe government closest to people governs best. Again, this DC bureaucracy versus local control stuff. He keeps hammering that over and over and over because he knows that his base hates DC. I am a fiscal conservative and a family conservative. And I'm a compassionate conservative because I know my philosophy is optimistic and full of hope for every American. In other words, he's trying to combine the kind of conservatism of, say, a Barry Goldwater with the more social conservatism of evangelical Christianity. He's trying to upgrade Reagan by putting a more Jesus-y spin on the whole thing, and to come up with a new term to pretend that it's new. That's what's going on here. Compassionate conservatism outlines a new vision of the proper role for the American government. Government must be limited and focused, but it has an important job within its bounds. Government is too often wasteful and overreaching. Irony alert. Because Bush was never wasteful. He never lost billions of dollars in Iraq that went unaccounted for. And he never overreached. Ever. I mean, his track record on staying within the bounds of laws and norms, spotless. He never pushed the bounds of what is legal in terms of violating civil liberties. Nothing like that. I mean, this man was above board 100% of the time. But we must correct it and limit it, not disdain it. So I guess this is the distinction with Reagan. He's like, look, government can be useful as long as it doesn't actually do anything. I differ with those who want to dismantle government down to the last paperclip, and with those who want to extend its reach. Government is neither the enemy nor the answer. The federal government has some compelling purposes: to defend our homeland, to keep peace in the world. So he believes in intervention wars, even at this early date. To help secure the retirement and health needs of our senior citizens, and to help our society confront human suffering. So earlier he talked about how he believed in slashing all kinds of programs that help poor people, but now he's saying that the government should have a role in doing that. So where do you stand? And also here he's saying that we need to secure the retirement and health needs of our seniors, but as president he did two things that contradict this. When he was first reelected in 2004 and then took his oath of office in early 2005, Bush claimed a mandate after barely winning the election, and then said he had a mandate to privatize Social Security. How in the fuck does that help senior citizens? It doesn't at all. It gives extra money from the Social Security Trust Fund to Wall Street to gamble with. That is not helping seniors. And also his Medicare Part D, this, from a supposed fiscal conservative, now it does help seniors afford drugs. However, it does not allow the government to negotiate prices with Big Pharma, so they can set whatever price they want, and it ends up being a giveaway to big pharmaceutical companies. So, such a great fiscal conservative that he doesn't even keep down the cost of a government program. And this actually is a way in which he expanded the federal government in a mostly positive way, but did it in a horribly incompetent and fiscally irresponsible manner. So, yeah, he lived up to his message for sure here. State and local government must educate children, put criminals behind bars, and maintain roads and basic services. But in some cases, the job is best done not by government itself, but by directing government resources to neighborhoods and parents and schools, and faith-based institutions that shape values and change lives. Why? Why not put it in the hands of institutions that will treat everyone equally? Institutions that are secular and can therefore incorporate everyone, rather than institutions that are particular and specific. Compassionate conservatism is neither soft nor fuzzy. Actually, it's both. It is both. It's very ill-defined. It talks about bullshit concepts like morality or moral decay, and doesn't talk about anything concrete. That would be soft and fuzzy. And it talks about like humping the flag and patriotism without any kind of substance behind it. I mean, this is the definition of soft and fuzzy. It is clear and compelling, only if you don't know what substance is. It focuses not on good intentions, but on good results. Bullshit, you're exactly wrong. This is all about talking about intentions and then not doing a damn thing. You talk about good intentions and then figure out how to funnel money to groups that will vote for you. That's what's really going on here, George. Compassionate conservatism applies conservative free market principles to the real job of helping real people. All people, including the poor and the disadvantaged. So by that metric, there actually is a real compassionate conservative who used conservative means to help alleviate poverty and make a state better. That was the compassionate conservatism of John Huntsman, the former governor of Utah. He actually did what Bush claims to do. Huntsman actually did things like reduce poverty, but through conservative means and helping private charities. So there actually was someone who put their money where George W. Bush's mouth was, but it wasn't George W. Bush. My vision of compassionate conservatism also requires America to assert its leadership in the world. Oh boy, here we go. We are the world's only remaining superpower, and we must use our power in a strong but compassionate way to help keep the peace and encourage the spread of freedom. So again, he complains about there not being enough military spending. But if we're the world's only remaining superpower, who are we fighting exactly? And how do we spread freedom in a compassionate way? Are there bombs that spread butterflies and rainbows? I mean, this is such bullshit rhetoric, and as we'll see, he believes this. And he did try to spread freedom, or at least his fucked up version of it, as president. The phrase compassionate conservative recognizes that a conservative philosophy has sometimes been mistakenly portrayed as mean-spirited. I like to joke that a compassionate conservative is a conservative with a smile, not a conservative with a frown. But that's exactly what the fuck it is. It's a conservative who has a little bit of charisma and charm, a conservative who can say conservative things but not come off like a dick. Basically, someone more like George W. Bush than someone like, say, Mitt Romney, or someone like Newt Gingrich. It's someone who just seems like a nice guy, saying the shit that other conservatives say and doing the things conservatives do. That's all it is. He even gives us the clue to the mirage. This is a case where a joke gives away the game. That's all compassionate conservatism is. This is just conservatism with a smile. It's the same repackaged horseshit with a slightly different label and a little bit different styling. Some who would agree with the conservative philosophy have been turned off by a strident tone. I have set a different tone. I advocate limited government because too much government limits innovation, restricts competition, and crowds out the market. So the strident tone alienating people, this is just the example of you needing a candidate who's appealing. That's just basic political science. And as for his advocacy of limited government, he's very selective, as we've observed, when it comes to who should have a monopoly and who shouldn't, and where the market should apply and where it shouldn't. Basically, if it's something that would help a common person, the market should decide, and rich people should just do what they want. If it's something that affects his friends, however, it should be socialist in nature, and it should be good public policy that affects the stakeholders in a positive way. I know the role of government is not to create wealth, but to create an environment where entrepreneurs and small businesses and producers are willing to risk and dream and build. As opposed to what? And also, government policies do create an environment where you can build wealth or not, by the way. So the idea that government can't create wealth is not even true. There have been cases in the past of radical reforms by governments that are struggling, which have really advanced them by decades. Bolivia advanced rapidly under Evo Morales, for instance, who implemented a lot of government-run programs. Same thing under Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He instituted fairly radical reforms, and those reforms brought with them rapid progress and wealth creation. So this is not, strictly speaking, accurate. I work to reform welfare because I believe it is far more compassionate to help individuals become independent than to trap them in a cycle of dependency and despair. I support local control of schools because I know local parents care far more about their own children than people in Washington do. Again, this Washington versus local shit. Over and over and over and over and over. I also said in Texas that we should educate children, all the children who live in my state. Texas shares a huge border with Mexico. We share close ties of history and culture and geography. We have aunts and uncles and cousins on both sides of the Rio Grande. Well, you don't, but Hispanic people do. I believe we should trade and visit freely with our neighbors in Mexico, but we must do a better job of stopping those who seek to come into our country illegally. I support strict border enforcement programs such as Operation Hold the Line, which concentrate Border Patrol officers and resources at known border crossing points. I believe it is far more compassionate to turn people away at the border than to attempt to find and arrest them once they are living here in our country illegally. So he kind of strikes a balance between Trump's position and a position of allowing people who are already here to stay. And if you look at his actual performance as president, he actually deported fewer people than Obama, who had no problem going around rounding people up. In many ways, it is a pro-corporate policy to not enforce immigration because it provides a lot of cheap labor, especially for agriculture. And it helps suppress wages in general because you have people who are willing to work for less than minimum wage. That being said, it is incredible how Bush sort of talked tough on immigration but then never did anything. And I think that's part of why Trump got elected and why the Republican base responded so positively to him, is because Bush, made a promise and then kind of just didn't do anything. And a lot of these people are totally in favor of going door to door and rounding people up. Well, Obama basically did it, but he didn't get credit for it because he's a Democrat. And he didn't want to talk about it too much because that would discredit him with his own base. So, yeah, again, when we talk about why Trump came into power, how he emerged politically, we have to talk a lot about George W. Bush, not just about Obama, but the whole neoliberal era created Trump. Trump, if neoliberalism is syphilis, Trump is just one of those sores that breaks out in your back. He is a symptom of neoliberalism. I also believe we should educate children in regards to the status of their parents. It is in our own best interest to do so. An educated child is far more likely to become a productive citizen. An educated child is also less likely to commit a crime. So again, he recognizes, although he won't say it elsewhere, that things like wealth and status impact crime rates. So if he were serious about reducing crime and being tough on crime, one way to do that is to fight poverty. Say if you had a war on poverty, perhaps. We have had a debate in Texas and throughout America about our national language. Oh, here's a hard issue, something that people are really staying up at night about. I believe people who live and work in America must learn to speak English. English is our common language and it reflects our common bond. The ability to speak and read and comprehend English is the gateway to success in our country. I call my philosophy English Plus. I like how he's trying to make it sound cool. English Plus, some bullshit words that I make up like strategery. I believe our language should be open to new words and innovations. And if you want to fuck up your grammar, that's also cool, man. There should be alternate ways to say things correctly. Like you should be able to say correctamundo as an adverb or as a noun. Keep people on their toes. I want all of America's children to learn to read and write in English. Plus, I want my own daughters to learn Spanish. Plus, I make an effort to speak Spanish myself. Plus, I recognize that the Hispanic heritage and culture are important to my state and our country and make America and Texas a richer place. Those who advocate English only poke a stick in the eye of Hispanic heritage, or people of Hispanic heritage. English only says me, not you. It says I count, but you do not. That is not the message of America. But that's basically your message, George. You're just saying like people should learn Spanish, but we should be English only. It's a stupid distinction without a difference, and it's clearly just pandering, trying to thread the needle between being favorable to Hispanic people, but also telling redneck voters that you're for them when the doors are closed and when push comes to shove. This is just political speak, from the supposed straight shooter. This is pure political speak. Incoming! Irony! I am optimistic that the next century will be one of great prosperity. Well, it would have been if we didn't have this one dipshit president who continued terrible deregulation in ill-advised ways and, then caused a housing bubble through his home ownership initiative. And then we had the greatest recession since the Great Depression. And under his leadership, we saw job growth, but it was all in the service industry and it was all low wage. So, yeah, if not for that president, we may have had a prosperous beginning to the 21st century, but we didn't. Although, to be fair, there was a larger problem in neoliberalism. So, he wasn't the cause of all of that, but he definitely hurt. America will be prosperous if we cut taxes. Reducing marginal tax rates will increase economic growth and create high-paying jobs. The problem is, we're now after the Bush presidency, and we can see the results of this. He cut taxes for the rich. The only permanent tax cuts, by the way, were for the rich. And that didn't stimulate job growth, certainly not in terms of high-paying jobs. Those were not created under Bush, mostly. And it also didn't really increase economic growth. So the so-called Laffer model or Laffer curve did not have the expected impact. Nor did it have that impact for Reagan. But they decided to try it again under Bush, and hell, Trump tried it again. So the Republicans just keep doing this. It's just their economic model to sucker the rich and forget about the poor. Throw the poor some crumbs and then just give the farm away to the rich. That's Republican Economics 101. By returning money to the taxpayers, we can also limit government. Money returned to Americans will not be spent on new or expanded government programs. Americans now have greater consumer debt than at any time in our nation's history. Returning money to their pockets will allow them to strengthen their family finances. Our tax code must also be fairer. The current tax structure makes it difficult for people to move from near poverty to the middle class, and we should remove that barrier. I support reducing the marriage penalty because the tax code should not conflict with our core values. So basically, he's predicting his own tax dividend that occurred later. Also, he's just talking about reducing taxes, and then people will be able to pay off their credit card bills. I guess that's what he's trying to imply. But what he's doing is selling a tax break that will mostly just help rich people. This is because he talked about top marginal rates. He means at the very top of the tax bracket, rich people. If you're poor, you get a little bit of money. Maybe you can help pay off your MasterCard with the equivalent of $500 you save on your taxes federally. I support reducing the death tax to make it easier to pass a family farm or small business on to the next generation, an essential element of the American dream. The so-called death tax, or to call it by its proper name, the estate tax, only applies to rich people. If you're a small farmer or a small businessman, if you own an antique store or something like that, this tax does not apply to you. This applies to people who have a lot of money. You have to have multiple millions of dollars for this to apply to you. So this is completely irrelevant to most people, yet it is effective at fear-mongering. A lot of people who own a small business definitely overrate their own wealth and feel that Bush and Republicans speak for them, when in reality, if you do the math, they certainly don't. America will be prosperous if we embrace free trade. Well, unless you want to have a good job, I guess. I want to end tariffs and break down barriers everywhere entirely so the whole world trades in freedom. By opening markets for our producers abroad, we enhance our prosperity at home. Not necessarily. You can get undercut when other countries have lower wages, and that forces you to lower your standards of labor. It forces wages down. Free trade is a terrible idea. The fearful build walls. Okay. The confident tear them down. I am confident in American workers and farmers and producers. I am confident that America's best, I assume he means the eyeglass company, is the best in the world. And America should not use food as a diplomatic weapon. We are too great a nation to starve people to achieve our foreign policy goals. As we export American goods and services, we also export American values. That reminds me of that song by Rammstein, We All Live in America. But also, here he seems to be promoting a kind of anti-boycott, like, what's the thing we do with Cuba? Anti-embargo. There we go. He seems to be sort of supporting an anti-embargo stance, but we know for a fact he continued the embargo against Cuba, and he also, I think, tried to impose an embargo on Venezuela. So clearly he does not actually believe in not using food as a weapon, because he did it. At least in the example of one country, and possibly two, and hell, maybe even more that I'm not aware of. So again, pure hypocrisy, and this guy is just pure shit. America must be prosperous to keep our commitments to the health and security and dignity of our senior citizens. Medicare should be strengthened by providing more choice and more private sector alternatives for the elderly, including plans that offer coverage for prescription drugs. I support medical savings accounts and patient protections and federal health care plans similar to the ones I signed in Texas. Yes, because having a personal savings account is the best and most responsible way to pay for health care. Health care costs aren't out of control or anything, and by saving $50 a month, you too can afford any medical emergency. That makes sense. I would not, however, support allowing the federal government to supersede the health care reforms already enacted by states such as mine. But most of those reforms are massively inadequate because states do not have the financial wherewithal to actually provide or reform health care in the way that a federal government does. Social Security is a solemn commitment, and we must preserve its guarantee for our seniors. Modernizing it will require a bipartisan effort. Social Security money should go only to Social Security, not to other programs, and Social Security taxes should not be increased. It already does go straight to Social Security. It's Congress that sometimes breaks into the trust fund. His opponent Al Gore called for a lockbox to protect it from any raiding whatsoever. I oppose government investment of Social Security funds and private stocks or bonds and believe we should trust individual Americans by giving them the option of placing part of their Social Security contributions into private retirement accounts. Because the market is totally reliable and never crashes, and people want to totally fuck themselves by investing their Social Security in the market. He tried to do this, by the way, and thank fuck it failed. And America must be prosperous to keep the peace. This is a unique moment in history. A generation after the successful struggle against an evil empire, a new generation of American leaders will determine how American power and influence are used. This is still a world of terror and missiles and madmen. And America's military is challenged by aging weapons, low morale, and failing intelligence. To keep the peace, we must rebuild America's military power. It wasn't demolished, though. Clinton downsized the military, but think about it. The USSR was gone. Why would we still need a Cold War size military? Who do we need 18 divisions to fight? Why do we need, say, was it 12 aircraft battle groups? Aircraft carrier battle groups? Why do we need that? Who are we going to take on that can equal that? I mean, it only makes sense to cut that back. Otherwise, it's a waste of money. And granted, it was deeply unpopular with the military because a lot of people got laid off. And I feel bad for the people who did. I mean, my dad was fortunate. He was able to avoid that. He was retained. But the thing is, look, what the hell did you expect Bill Clinton to do given that circumstance? You can't justify maintaining a military designed to combat the Soviet Union at a time when there is no threat on the scale of the Soviet Union. It's an unrealistic expectation. Peace is not ordained, it is earned. Building a durable peace requires strong alliances, expanding trade, and confident diplomacy. What is confident diplomacy? Is that where you say, do what I say or I'll beat the shit out of you? I assume that's what he means. It requires tough realism in our dealings with China and Russia. It requires firmness with regimes like North Korea and Iraq, regimes that hate our values and resent our success. So I didn't realize this phrase went back this far, but later when he talked about why terrorists attacked us, he said they're jealous of our freedoms. What the fuck does that mean? But he was saying this shit all the way back then. That was something I didn't realize he was saying even as a candidate. I mean, at one point I was under the impression that he had campaigned as like a non-intervention guy, but reading his book, it's very clear that he held neoconservative values way before he was elected. I know in some of the debates apparently he messaged as something of a moderate, but he and Karen Hughes in this book clearly sound very hawkish. And the foundation of our peace is a strong, capable, and modern American military. Back-to-back deployments, poor pay, shortages of spare parts and equipment, and rapidly declining readiness have undermined the military's morale. Was he psychic? Or is this just ironic? And also, what back-to-back deployments? Clinton started deployments in Somalia on a small scale and in the former Yugoslavia on a larger but still limited scale. The military was not stretched nearly as thin as it was under Bush. Complaining about back-to-back deployments in the 90s compared to the 2000s is a fucking joke. Also, shortages of spare parts and equipment. Remember when Bush sent the military to Iraq and wasn't able to provide armor for all the Humvees that were expected to patrol the streets and potentially get shot up or bombed? Yeah. So that was only like a Clinton problem. Bush fixed that shit on day one, obviously. Not since the years before Pearl Harbor has our investment in national defense been so low a percentage of our gross national product. We also hadn't faced less of a threat since before Pearl Harbor. So what do you expect? Again, you have to be realistic. Why would you spend a ton of money when you're not at war and when you have no major rival? That makes no sense. Nearly 12,000 members of the armed forces are on food stamps. Well, that would be a problem. I assume he may be right here. And yeah, obviously the military, especially privates, are underpaid. Especially if you're a private who joins up and then you have a girlfriend or wife, she gets pregnant, you have a child. Whatever they're making would not be adequate to live a very comfortable existence. So I agree that military pay should be raised, but in terms of just spending as much money as humanly possible on defense, that's just idiotic. And especially in a context where you're not actually at war. That's just a poor use of national resources. I support increased pay and better benefits and training for our citizen soldiers. A volunteer military has only two paths. It can lower its standards to fill its ranks, or it can inspire the best and brightest to join and stay. Bush, of course, ended up opting for the former because his invasion of Iraq, his voluntary war in Iraq, created conditions where the military had a lot of trouble retaining people and getting people to sign up, and the only way to make sure the ranks were filled was to lower the standards. A modern military requires higher standards than, say, a pre-modern military, or even, say, World War II military, because of the extensive use of technology and the expense of equipment. You don't want to entrust someone who is not terribly bright with a complex piece of machinery that costs millions of dollars. But under Bush, because he created this recruitment crisis by engaging in a voluntary war, we had no choice. They had to lower the standards of the military to fill the ranks. And a lot of people who may have signed up otherwise, who would have potentially been more apt as soldiers, weren't able to join, or decided not to join, because they knew they'd get deployed multiple times to Iraq and they had a high chance of dying or being severely wounded. And a lot of people, let's face it, sign up for the military to pay for college. That's why probably half the people who are in the military are there. We're keeping it real. So if you have to worry about dying because of a dumb voluntary war, well, guess what? Fewer people are going to choose that path. So there you go. The long-standing commitments we have made to our allies are the strong foundation of our current peace. America must keep its pledges to defend friends from aggression. But our military should not become permanent peacekeepers, dividing warring parties. America should work with our allies to develop political solutions and a timetable to bring our troops home from places like Bosnia and Kosovo. So the bullshit meter just broke. So America was doing police actions in Bosnia and Kosovo. And the thing is, the one problem with him criticizing these actions is that this was the one time where American intervention actually worked, where there was a plan, it was followed, and now the former Yugoslavia has a number of different nations, and all of them are more or less doing well. So he chose the one example where American intervention actually worked and criticized that. He complained about a lack of a timetable and a lack of a political solution. Famously, he and his supporters like Rummy and Cheney, Darth Dick, said that we shouldn't leave Iraq. And we still have senators today like Lindsey Graham who say we should not leave Iraq or Afghanistan. We should stay forever. But they had the balls to criticize the Clinton administration back in the day. And this is awkward, having to defend the Clinton administration. I hate Bill Clinton. But damn, I mean, he was better than Bush, especially when it came to this. Fuck. Rebuilding America's homeland defenses is an urgent priority. From who's going to attack us? Was he watching Red Dawn one night and it just stuck in his craw? I support deploying anti-ballistic missile systems to guard against attack and blackmail. 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 What? Blackmail. Blackmail from who? Blackmail about what? A country can't be blackmailed. What the fuck are you talking about? And America should modernize its military capability, not by reauthorizing all of the weapons of the past, but by investing in research and development to make our military more mobile, more agile, and more suited to the needs of the 21st century. In reality, what Bush ended up advocating for, especially under Rumsfeld, was a military more suited to police actions, the thing that he intended on fighting more of. America cannot keep the peace alone. We must work closely with our friends and allies. As the governor of Texas, I have reached out to our neighbors in Mexico. I have worked to build bridges of personal diplomacy. He does not believe in diplomacy. Remember the coalition of the willing, which was the U.S., Britain, and like Iceland? He did not do a good job building coalitions when he actually became president. Mexico is our friend, and friends solve problems in a spirit of mutual trust and respect. America's foreign policy should respect and nurture our traditional alliances throughout the world and strengthen relations with countries in our own neighborhood. With Canada and Mexico and the countries of Central and South America, we have an opportunity to create a powerful free trade or free market alliance. CAFTA, in other words, is what he's talking about here. Again, free trade helps to gut the middle class, and it is very bad for labor. The world seeks America's leadership, looks for leadership from a country whose values are freedom and justice and equality. Ours should not be the paternalistic leadership of an arrogant big brother, but the inviting and welcoming leadership of a great and noble nation. We shouldn't, for instance, insist that Iraq had WMDs against the UN's advice, invade with 1 or 2 friends, and occupy it for 20 years. That would be acting like Big Brother. Can't have that. We have an individual responsibility to our families and our communities, and a collective responsibility as citizens of the greatest and freest nation in the world. America must not retreat within its own borders. Our greatest export is freedom, and we have a moral obligation to champion it throughout the world. By force if necessary. We should champion freedom by invading other countries and then appointing our own people as leaders. And then when they get a president, we should choose that president, because that's the real way to do freedom and democracy. If it's appointed by a country that has democracy, it's democratic. Probably. I think that's how it works. I have many reasons to run for president and many things I want to accomplish for our country. I want to change the tone of our national discourse. Another example of professional class bullshit. National discourse is not that important, really. Not when compared to material policy achievements. This is another Foucauldian slippage. Another attempt to say that what people say about things is so important, and that's really what we should focus on, when in reality we need to focus on action. The government does action. It controls the purse strings. It controls bureaucracy. It controls equipment and personnel. We need to focus on action, not discourse. Discourse is for people on the sidelines. Americans look at Washington and they don't like what they see. Who can blame them? They see partisanship and bickering. Oh yeah, Bush didn't contribute to that at all. Bush was not a partisan hack who politicized the Justice Department or anything like that. He didn't say you're with us or against us, and he didn't try to critique the patriotism of people who weren't for his stupid-ass wars. They see some who would rather score a point for the next election than get something done for the good of the nation. People often ask me, can you do in Washington what you have done in Texas? Washington is different, they say. So partisan and bitter. What he's saying is that there are people in the world who realize that Texas is effectively a one-party system. Now, you can say that about the U.S. as a whole, but at least there are some differences between national Democrats and Republicans. As we saw when we look back at Texas in our earlier chapters, the fact is Texas has one party, the Republican Party, and some of the Republicans call themselves Democrats. They agreed on every substantive issue. Bush had zero opposition to his agenda. Zero. So what they're asking is, can you participate in a political system where you might have a few people who disagree with you? So they were basically saying, can you do it when it's not a layup? Which is a legit question. I recognize that it's a big challenge, but I believe an administration can change the tone of American politics, and I believe we must do so. So again, it's all about tone and culture and things that are non-material and that are fluffy and hard to pin down. Your success or failure in discourse is really hard to determine or measure. He's all about accountability, supposedly, but he rarely imposes it on himself. Odd. Public cynicism about our government is a fundamental threat to our American democracy. You know what would make that worse, though? Like if some presidential candidate were to say, steal an election. That would cause some cynicism, I think, too. It would also show that the democratic system has some flaws and some holes. But Bush is all about hope. Self-government is only as good as those who are willing to participate. Most people who seek election do so because they want to accomplish good for our country, or get rich by establishing contacts and then win some fame and glory and make it easier for themselves to get laid. But, you know, also the public good thing, I guess. This is the beginning of a common bond. Republicans and Democrats in Congress come from different places, different backgrounds, and different perspectives. Yet we all run for office because we want to make America a better country. That is a great place to start. Again, I like this fake optimism, this fake Mr. Smith goes to Washington shit. He knows this isn't true. I mean, his dad was president. And he is a slime fuck himself. He works around all slime fucks. They don't believe anything, fundamentally. I know that I'm seeking an awesome responsibility. I know that serving as governor of Texas is not anywhere near the same as being president. But if Texas were a nation, it would be the 11th largest economy in the world. I've had some success, and I've learned to lead. You cannot lead by dividing people. I'm a uniter, not a divider. My campaign will be positive, hopeful, and inclusive. I want to show that politics, after a time of tarnished ideals, can be higher and better. I hope to give our country a fresh start after a season of cynicism. But what he brought about was an age of fear and the flag. That's really what he brought about. He brought about patriots versus non-patriots. He talked about things like you're with us or you're with the terrorist. He said that you're either for American values or you're for the homosexual agenda. That's the real George W. Bush in office. He also doesn't believe in democracy. The man stole the 2000 election. So yeah, that's not divisive at all to steal an election. I'm running hard, and I'm running to win. That's unique. No presidential candidate has ever tried that before. And I feel a remarkable sense of freedom. What? What the hell does that mean? And I know that no matter what happens during the months ahead, my wife will love me, my daughters will love me, the dog will love me, and the cats will pretend they don't, but they really will. And my dad answered one of my doubts about seeking the office he held in a letter to Jeb and me last year. Am I the only one, or do I find it a little weird that he keeps putting in letters from his dad? I mean, I get that he's trying to push that he's close to his dad, and I know that especially in his post-presidency, he became very close with his dad as he helped take care of him as he was, aging and getting sick and whatever. But it seems like he shares a lot of personal correspondence, and it is a little odd. I mean, don't they have any secrets in their family or any kind of personal discrepancy? I mean, are these letters written for public consumption? Because it sort of seems like they are. If all of them are things that W can put in his books and his dad's like, yeah, share my private thoughts with the world. It just seems odd to me. I don't know. Anyway, to quote H.W. Bush, Bush 41, your mother tells me that both of you have mentioned to her your concerns about some of the political stories, the ones that seem to put me down and make me seem irrelevant, that contrast you favorably to a father who had no vision and who was but a placeholder in a broader scheme of things. I have been reluctant to pass on advice. Both of you are charting your own course. But the advice is this. I don't know if that's a good HW or not. I'll just stop doing it in case it sucks. Do not worry when you see the stories that compare you favorably to a dad for whom English was a second language and for whom the word destiny meant nothing. H.W. had a very famous father himself, so the idea that he didn't have a destiny is bullshit. Also, this idea about him having English as a second language, H.W. was gaffe-prone in the prime Biden way, and he was goofy, but he could be eloquent when he needed to, and no one questioned his intelligence. He just wasn't very articulate. But he was a plenty intelligent guy. He's nothing like W, who's a fucking moron. First, I am content with how historians will judge my administration, even on the economy. To be fair, most historians now take a relatively positive-ish view of HW at least. I hope and think they will say we helped change the world in a positive sense. It is inevitable that the new breed of journalists will have to find a hook in stories. We'll have to write not only on your plans and your dreams, but we'll have to compare those with what, in their view, I failed to accomplish. That can be hurtful to a family that loves each other. But the advice is don't worry about it. At some point, both of you may want to say, well, I don't agree with Dad on that point, or frankly, I think Dad was wrong on that. Do it. Chart your own course. Not just on the issues, but on defining yourselves. No one will ever question your love of family, your devotion to your parents, so do not worry when the comparisons might be hurtful to your dad, for nothing can ever be written that will drive a wedge between us. Nothing at all. So read my lips, no more worrying. This from your proud and devoted dad. So, I feel like this is an unnecessary piece of advice, and also I feel like he's sanctioning something that he knows his sons will do anyway, especially since they're both friends of Karl Rove, who is a ruthless son of a bitch. So, yeah, clearly, I don't know, I think this letter was designed for public consumption. So maybe I'm being cynical, but I think that a lot of the father-son dynamic was publicized on purpose, and that they cultivated this relationship in a way that made it more publicly palatable and made them seem a lot more human. Anyway, let's get to our conclusion at long fucking last. During the opening months of my presidential campaign, I have traveled our country and my heart has been warmed. My experiences have reinvigorated my faith in the greatness of Americans. They have reminded me that societies are renewed from the bottom up, not the top down. Everywhere I go, I see people of love and faith, taking time to help a neighbor in need. So he had to travel to see Americans do good things. That's weird. Like, if he had any kind of, say, activist side to him, if he actually cared about things, he would be seeing these people a lot, because they would be the people he'd listen to rather than oil executives. I met Mary Jo Coleman, a cheerful woman with a big smile and a bigger heart, whose Sharing and Caring Hands program provides shelter, transportation, food, dental service, and bountiful love to the homeless in St. Paul, Minnesota. I visited a church in downtown Columbus, Ohio, whose leaders have taken a former crack house and turned it into a house of faith and worship. One thing that he might not have noticed in Columbus when he was there is that when he first got elected, there were still 2 factories, one of which was Buckeye Steel, that employed a whole lot of people. And then early in his administration, due to the outsourcing policies of both Bush and his predecessors, 2 factories closed down, and this created massive unemployment and poverty here in Columbus. Also, in terms of the church that used to be a former crack house, I think it is now once again boarded up. I'm pretty sure I know what one he's talking about. But whatever. I met farmers in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, who have been helped by the Adoptive Farm Family Ministry during times of personal and financial crisis, and who have in turn helped others. I met grandmothers who are helping kindergarten students learn to read at the Bruce Guadalupe School, a private, nonprofit school run by Milwaukee's largest Latino social service organization, the United Community Center. And in Ohio, I met 2 soldiers in the Armies of Compassion, Kurt and Eileen Thomas, who humbly wash the feet of those less fortunate as directors of the Haven of Rest Ministries. So basically pushing this whole idea of religion once again, and also public-private partnerships, not public-private partnerships, excuse me, but giving money to private organizations. And now for the photo finish. How does he end this bullshit? Last paragraph of the entire book. These people and thousands more like them are the heart and soul and greatness of America, and I want to do my part. I am running for president because I believe America must seize this moment. America must lead. We must give our prosperity a greater purpose, a purpose of peace and freedom and hope. We are a great nation of good and loving people, and together we have a charge to keep. So, lame as possible conclusion, no real substance, and it's perfectly fitting because that is exactly what the book itself was. So, that is the end of our journey. It seems like it's been about 3 months, probably been longer, or at least it feels longer, but it's probably been 3 months. At some point, I will be reading Bush's decision points, but I'm going to be delaying that for a while. I don't think I can take much more of Bush anytime soon. I might start resuming my older Bush Still Sucks series, where I don't have to read his words verbatim in this way. But I thought it would be nice just to see that his own words, in many ways, are damning, and to show you that it's not just me interpreting these things, that Bush himself provides you with plenty of ammunition if you just know how to read him correctly. Until next time, I'm Thucydides the Historian. This is the end of A Charge to Keep, and let's do a quick poll in the comments below for those of you who finished the video. Should I or should I not burn this book now that I've completed it? Let me know. Thanks.